As you know, Lara has said, thank you so much for attending this multi-chapter event. The theme of this is pride and intersectionality, and it is very timely given that June is Pride Month. But we know that whenever we celebrate something, whether it's a day, a week, or a month, especially as important as this, it's not just one day or 1 week or 1 month. And that's why we're having this today, and why we have invited our illustrious guest, Evan Thornberg. So a couple of things. I want to give you the flow of how this session is going to go. We're going to have break this out in 2 halves. So the first half is going to be educational, and we're going to have a breakout session, so the second half is going to be around taking action and showing support. And so again, that will have a breakout session. What we're going to ask is when you go to the breakout session that you appoint, and sometimes we do have to appoint someone because everybody doesn't like to raise their hands to report out after your breakout session, but to give some feedback and learnings from the group. And then at the end, what we'll do is take some final few moments to address any additional questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and then do a wrap up. So with that, I want to take this away and introduce you to Evan Thornberg. I'm going to read a little because I can't, it's going to take up some time to read Evan's entire bio, but Evan Thornberg, and she's going to tell you what the acronyms behind her name actually mean, the MAUB and all of that. I think that's just wonderful, and I don't want to mess that up. But Evan currently serves as the Health Equity Special Advisor for the Philadelphia Department of Public Health in the AIDS Activities Coordination Office. And she's previously served as the city and residents of Philadelphia as the Deputy Director of the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs and the Director of Training and Program Development of the Mayor's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Kinney administration. So just with that, because that was a mouthful, that we have the right person on the call today. Evan is an expert in intersectionality in systems of healthcare and public health, specializing in policy legislation, equity-based program development, and comprehensive training on populations, on health equity, health disparities, social determinants of health, and the inclusion of vulnerable populations. Evan grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Houston, Texas, and she received her BA in American Studies / Civilizations from Ursinus College. And by the way, she just completed, I want to give a little round of applause and claps here, because she just completed her master's in urban bioethics at Temple School of Medicine, specializing in misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories in public health and medicine. And I think when I say those 3 words, misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy, they should resonate with all of us, because there's a lot of that is flying around right now in many aspects. Evan has trained thousands of individuals and collaborated with hundreds of organizations and institutions over the last 15 years when it comes to inclusion, competency, advocacy, and proactive engagement of marginalized and vulnerable communities. Now, that's a lot that Evan does, but I want to tell you what she likes to do outside of work. Evan believes that there's never too much reading, coffee, or drawing that can be had or done in this world, all of which she likes and actually loves to do with her furry best friends, Harley Quinn and Noon. Welcome, 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 Evan Thornberg to Ellevate Network.
Thank you. That was so fancy. I you know what? I don't read my own bio too often. I just send it off.
Yeah.
And I feel like I have to burn some things because it feels over the top.
We are never, see, that's the thing with us, these women that are in this room, women in general, we are never over the top. We are enough, but we always want to get better and a little more. So keep striving. And as your mother would say, this latest degree that you got, this is one of more to come. So just remember that.
It's her favorite thing. It's her favorite thing about me.
So, Evan, would you tell us what, you have the initials MAUB behind your name. What does that mean?
So it stands for the Masters of Arts in Urban Bioethics and Medical Ethics. I mean, it's a specialized degree in bioethics. Temple did a really amazing thing when I was looking to go into and master in bioethics. One of the things that I found was that Temple had the only urban bioethics program in the nation. And what that is, it's the term that they use is urban bioethics, but basically they teach bioethics through the lens of health equity. It felt very important to me that bioethics weren't being taught in sort of a vacuum of being inapplicable to the work I did and to the work I want to be doing. And a lot of bioethics courses are a little, what I like to say, are heady, or kind of like disconnected from like the realities of what happens in medicine. They're a little more philosophical than I prefer. I really wanted to learn more about the application of and the gravity of applying these constructs in medicine and in public health to like the realities of the world and the issues that we're seeing today. I also wanted to talk about those issues, and I wanted them to be stimulated in conversation. So that's why it looks a little different. Most people who have a bioethics degree it says MBE, so a Master's of Bioethics is usually the letters, and that's why my letters are a little different.
Well, thank you for that. And, we're grateful to you to want to. I mean, you actually want to do something that will help the people that really need it. We all need help every now and again, but those vulnerable and marginalized populations often are left out of the conversation. And so, because you're bringing them into the conversation, I applaud you for that. And this is why this first session that we're going to do, and there's 5 questions, and even though there are only 5 questions that I will be asking and we'll be talking about, we know that those can sometimes run for a while, just because of the context and the content that is involved with them. So the first question that I have, Evan, is, it's Pride Month. So why do we celebrate Pride Month every June, and why is this important? Not just because of, it being signed, as a bill, but and into law, but as a federal holiday. But why is it important?
So first of all, I love this question because it means we have to talk about the history of Pride. Pride's actually very young. It's about 50 years old, the like formal celebration of Pride. It started with the Stonewall Inn in New York. This is like the formal history, although there were other instances like this before. Actually, one of them that predates the Stonewall was at the place called Little Pete's in Philadelphia in 1966. But the official start date's June something 1969. I think it was like June 28th, 1969. And Stonewall Inn was this little tiny dive bar, LGBTQ dive bar inclusive. It was owned by the mafia. And so they paid kind of exorbitant money off the bar to be able to do kind of whatever they want to do. At the time, there was a lot of laws that prohibited certain kind of clothing on people, that prohibited all sorts of it limited drag, it limited a lot of things. If you were found to have less than I think it was 4 articles of clothing on you that were of the opposite gender, you could be arrested for. It was something called like gender something. I don't remember the name of the law. Basically, what these laws would do is they just kind of gave carte blanche to the police to harass LGBTQ people and LGBTQ institutions. So what they would frequently do is they would raid a place, uh, line up all the folks. A lot of times the police would ask for bribes or kind of go through the pockets of people. And for people who couldn't pay up or people who wouldn't, they'd haul them off to prison, they'd arrest them. So a lot of LGBTQ people had like 3, 4, 5 arrests, because if you wanted to go be in community and be yourself, you were going to be arrested. It just was going to happen. And Stonewall was infamously known because unlike a lot of other bars whose landlords at some point would get tired of the raids and kind of close the bar down. The mafia actually didn't care. They liked the money that they were making. They liked being in the niche or like entity business because they knew there was always going to be business because nobody else would take it. So it was a weird hand-in-hand relationship that they had. So the Stonewall Inn was well established and well known. So in 1969, finally, this exactly happens. The police come in. There's drag performances happening. There's all sorts of LGBTQ folks. There's people that we would now say are trans men there. There was all sorts of people hanging out. They block the doors. They hold everybody in there. And they start going down the line and going through people's pockets. And a lot of people who were there that night tell this story. So that's how we know so many fresh details. And one of the drag performers became really incensed and finally had gotten fed up. She might have been a little drunk. We don't know. And she decided to fight the police. She threw her shoes and then it kind of went from there. And then somebody from the outside, this is usually identified as Marsha Johnson, I think is the last name, trans woman who frequently would be outside. She didn't oftentimes was unable to get in because she didn't always have the cover for the door, Black trans woman. She threw a brick from the outside and smashed the window, and it kind of was like everything's off to the races. And so there was this huge dust up with the police. The police were woefully outnumbered. And so then what ended up happening is that the people at the Stonewall trapped the police in the Stonewall Inn and wouldn't let them leave, and then were sort of tussling with them. So the first Pride is known for a lot of LGBTQ people as a riot. The following year, there was a huge protest on the day of that riot a year later. A lot of people got arrested. There was a lot that happened. And so to protest these like arcane and really discriminatory laws, there was this huge protest the following year in 1970. And then subsequently thereafter. And that's the story of the first Pride. So that's why we do that in June. That's why we have Pride, is to acknowledge this moment when LGBTQ people finally decided to stand up and defend themselves against discrimination. And then post that, there's just kind of a lot of we have this, symbolic, what we're now calling, is now a parade and stuff like that. But was originally were ongoing protests yearly on this day to celebrate this. And now we do them all over the world. One of my favorite things to hear about is that in a Kenyan refugee camp, they had a pride parade. And I thought that's amazing that there are a group of people in a little refugee camp who fly a flag and do a parade through their little refugee camp. So Pride really means a lot to people all over the world, no matter where they are. And they try to hold true to it if they can. I like to say if there's three, even if there's two LGBTQ people together somewhere, they're going to celebrate Pride. They're going to have a little parade. And I think that's amazing.
It's interesting, this history, because I really didn't know the history. I mean, I've heard of Stonewall and, a little bit of the story behind it. But, this was in 1969. And, when I wrote down, you said more than 4 pieces of clothing of the opposite sex. And it's like, did they have this, list of clothing? Because it's not that you can look at someone and automatically think that, they are from the LGBTQ plus community. And just because you would go to a bar or a place that, frequents the LGBT plus community doesn't mean that you are. So it would be interesting if there was a list of clothes that they would say, well, you identify this way. We understand that if, you're a drag performer, then, you would have on clothing of who you are, who you're being at that point. But, the 4 pieces of clothing really stood out for me. Also, Kenyan refugee camp. I love that. And of course, it's been on the news about this new law. It's one of the African countries, and I'm trying to think if it was Nigeria, that just signed the
Uganda.
Uganda, the world's most strict and horrific law where you could actually be put to death for having sex with someone of the same sex. This is just incredible, and it goes against, in my opinion, humanity, human rights, and there are other countries that are wanting to follow this now. So
Well, I want us to be unique in the way that we talk about, because homophobia is an imported issue. It's a colonial issue, and modern homophobia is actually an exported product from the United States predominantly. And what I mean by that is that frequently we hear of these things like these other countries, especially we love to demonize African countries. We love to demonize like underdeveloped or developing nations, South American nations, all of these. But these countries, homophobia is uniquely not intrinsic to them. And what I think is important for people to know about the Uganda bill is that it was actually spearheaded as an initiative by an American, I like to say, like extremist Christian group that has been kind of kind of canned designing this sort of legislation and exporting it to these countries that are.
I'm sorry, Evan. Would everyone please put your microphones on mute, please? Thank you.
Exporting it to these countries that they're doing an exceptional amount of hyper Christian ministering, what's it called? Not ministering, but traveling to those places and doing all sorts of projects, trying to spread the gospel. And I don't say that to
like
demonize
missionaries.
religion. Missionaries, yeah, missionary work, but like very intensive missionary work. And so this is when we see these things, I want people to know that like queer people are in Uganda, queer people are organized in Uganda. There are queer organizations, long-standing queer organizations in these countries. And for a lot of these countries, like places like I can say like Botswana, they didn't have language for queer people because queer people just were. And so some of these countries organizing against homophobia, organizing against these sort of extremist legislative endeavors is new, not because queer people or queer organizing is new, but because they never had to until you had this imported kind of, again, like very much special interest designed legislation and attack, because these places are seen as being less capable or intelligent to be able to fight this sort of extremism. So I want us to be like, when we give presentations like this in the US, I want us to think about the cataclysmic effects that we have on the rest of the world, that we are not separate at our borders, and that the folks that are looking to demonize women's rights, looking to demonize LGBTQ rights, looking to demonize people of color's rights, indigenous rights, these people are usually the same people. And they're usually not just working here, they're usually testing things out here, because if they can get it past us, because 98% of the US is literate and live in developed space, then they can successfully export it a lot of other places. So that's why it's important for us to talk about it and address it and be actively pushing back too.
Thank you for that. I'm sure that we are all learning so much. And the next thing that I want to learn about is or are the acronyms. There's LGBTQ, and I don't know if I'm getting those correct, but then there's the plus. Would you educate us on what these acronyms mean? And, and also just because it's an acronym, like sexual identity, sexual identification, some of these things are a little confusing for a lot of us, because as you said, this is fairly new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the language is new and the language is ever expanding. So it's one of those, it's a community. And I actually think this for a lot of marginalized populations is that language is ever shifting and changing. I think about that with like the struggle for civil rights and Black suffragette work throughout a number of different eras, is that Black people have talked about themselves as Black, they've talked about themselves as colored, they've talked about themselves as African American. And so like the same thing happens in the LGBTQ community, where our language is ever growing and becoming more inclusive. And so obviously the first, maybe not obviously for some folks, is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. That's LGBTQ. It originally used to be GLBTQ, but in solidarity with second wave feminism, there was a consortium of queer people that got together and decided to move the L forward and in front, and also as an ode to the on the ground work that lesbians did during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. Lesbians were the first people to respond to the death and dying of gay men from HIV and AIDS. And lesbians were some of the only people who were not afraid to do things like touch and care for the sick and the dying. So in solidarity with that historic care, lesbians were moved to the front of the acronym. I always think that's like such an interesting little tidbit people don't know. It's also why you might see older folks still say GLBTQ, because they don't, they got used to one way of talking about it. The plus is when we started to add a lot of other folks, and and that would be folks like intersex people, asexual people, questioning folks, two-spirit, I think is in there, pansexual. There's quite a few letters that get added on, and instead of making people say a whole host of letters, what the plus signifies for most of us is that we're ever expanding the community and including people. I see a question in the chat. Can I answer it?
Yes.
Yes, I was just going to ask Evan, do you want me to jump in when those come up?
Sure. I mean, I
All right.
see them when I
Okay,
see
perfect.
them. Yeah. So intersex is when someone is born without the assignment, or they can't be assigned either female or male at birth. I think I used to say there's over 82 different ways, but I think more recently there's over 100 different varieties biologically for how you can be categorized as intersex. Most people do not discover that they're intersex until they're teens or they're trying to get pregnant. That's usually when a lot of people discover this about themselves. A lot of intersex people get wrongfully assigned female at birth and don't realize it. That they have, and that their body is different. This can be everything from having ambiguous genitalia, but this can also be things like being androgen resistant, for example. And someone who's androgen resistant may have XY chromosomes, but would have developed physically as fully as a woman. That their body would look and have been assigned female at birth because they're androgen resistant, so their body doesn't transition at puberty. There's a lot of different ways. I mean, this is a science course that nobody can have in one day, let alone answer in one question. So we include intersex people because for a long time, intersex people have experienced all sorts of biases in the medical community. Frequently, intersex children, when they have ambiguous genitalia, receive without consent, because they're newborns, what's called compassion surgery, which is cosmetic altering of their genitals that often render their genitals not functional when prior they might have been, if that makes sense. So, and then this is also putting children through all sorts of things, like, at against their consent. Again, I have a big thing with consent. I think children can consent and have an understanding of their health. And for a lot of intersex kids, they're forced to do things like take hormones, which is not something they may want to do. They may be comfortable with the way that their body is changing at puberty, instead of forcing them into being either a girl or a boy. They want to maybe live biologically right where they're supposed to be. So that population has been really fighting for their right to not be medically tampered with. And it's been very hard. A lot of famous people that you do not know are intersex. One of my favorite examples is the feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa is actually an intersex person. She was told she was a girl all her life and then had issues, I think in the bridge, one of her writings, but I think it's in The Bridge That Is My Back. She writes about having difficulty, really violent and difficulty with periods. And it turns out that her family has to reveal to her that they had her body altered and there was all these things that were happening. But yeah, it's really interesting. She's an intersex person. So that's intersex in a nutshell.
Mhm.
How
How about pansexual?
pansexual is first of all, pan is the Latin word for all. It just means all of something. So like Pan-Africanism is all of Africa, keep it simple. And so pansexual people basically are saying that it's not about gender for them, it's about who a person is that creates the attractiveness for them. They're open to dating people who are non-binary, they're open to dating people who are intersex, they're open to dating people who are women or men, who are any number across the spectrum. For them, it's about a connection between another person. If you've ever heard, I think younger people, like people under 35, are also comfortable using the word queer. Queer gets used in the same way, sort of. But again, it's an option. Some people don't like using queer because of the negative connotation it's had in history, and so people prefer pansexual instead.
Now,
Yeah, they're pretty interchangeable. The queer and pansexual are pretty interchangeable in terms of definition. Now, every person has their own way that they define it for themselves,
mhm.
but that's the caveat. But yeah, they are used in some similar style.
Okay, all right. And so I see, the question there, the other identities. I mean, we've identified and talked about the Q,
Mhm.
the intersex, pansexual. Now I see 2SAA.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
So it's 2 and S, which is two spirit. That's acknowledging an indigenous gender. That's very specific to the indigenous populations.
Mhm.
Going back to that story, or the point I made about colonialism imported homophobia and transphobia. And here in the US, which was previously known as Turtle Island, for the indigenous populations that lived here, most of those communities had between 4 and 7 genders that they identified. For them, gender wasn't about your physical body, it was about the role that you decisively wanted to play in community and what you felt. These were also mystic or a polytheistic or communities that felt that there were certain people among them who spoke or communed with spirits, and those people would not embody any one specific gender, that those people, in order to be the most connected to the spirits that they engaged with and believed in, those people would have to transcend gender, essentially. And those people collectively would be called two-spirit. Every tribe or clan has their own language for the genders that they had, but two-spirit was sort of where most indigenous groups in North America kind of landed and decided that's the language we'll use for these people, for this group.
Okay.
But it's a reclamation of an indigenous understanding of gender.
And then AA, or is that one, or is it two?
It's 2, and one of those is asexual. That's people who don't feel romantically, they don't feel sexually connected. Generally, they don't have an urge or an impetus to be sexually active. It's not that they aren't, it's just not a major part of how they date. And I will be honest with you, I think the last A is for ally. I think that's the addition. There is some controversy back and forth about that for a lot of folks, like whether or not that sort of inclusion makes sense. But I don't like to get into, like, personally, I think it's like
Yeah.
a nitpicking fight. I don't know, but that's me. That's very much singularly subjective opinion.
Now, learning about, what the different letters mean is so important and key, and it's not communicated, I think, in mainstream enough. Now, while we're on the subject, gender pronouns.
Mhm.
And everyone asks, even on applications, if you're looking for a job now, they're asking, what are your gender pronouns?
Mhm.
as well as sometimes they're asking, how do you identify, outside of your, the way that you were identified as at birth. So why do these gender pronouns matter? And how is it tied into the LGBTQ plus community?
I would say it's tied into the LGBTQ plus community because the LGBTQ plus community has been one of the foremost or entities that has been asking that we talk about or we not presume gender of people. And what I mean by that is that when you think about it in a lot of ways, I don't think pronoun like the conversation of pronouns and the way that it's also demonized is so funny to me because everyone has a pronoun that you're strongly attached to. Now, if you've been lucky, the pronouns you were given at birth are the ones that you are strongly attached to. They're you default to. You're very much like, those are mine, and I'm really excited about them. But consequently, in a world, especially thinking about a world post or trying to move past COVID, we have decided that like a lot of things are virtual. And so, for instance, when I started my job at the height of COVID, I had not physically in person met any of my colleagues. I didn't know who these people were. I'm seeing them in emails, in email signatures. So one of the best examples I give around gender pronouns is the fact that we ask that people identify them so that we know who you are. And in things like email, like my name is Evan. That is my that was the name I was given at birth. My parents had a real struggle picking out names. They were fighting over names. And they decided they would just pick one name and no matter who came out, that's what they were going to get. So I was going to be Evan no matter my gender. And they also liked the fact that Evan would give me a lot of wide access in the world because my gender couldn't be presumed from my name. But what that often leads to is people being like, "Dear Mr. Thornberg." And one time, really funnily enough, I had somebody write, "Dear Mr. Thornberg, something, something, something." And I wrote back and I was like, "Here's the answers to your questions. And oh, by the way, I'm not Mr. Just so you know, I'm not Mr. Thornberg, right?" And it was sort of like a haha. And I thought that they would assume then that, oh, I'm sorry, she, her, or they, them, or whatever. No, they wrote back and they were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor." And I was like, no, we're moving further away.
Yes.
So pronouns are super important because it helps us talk about other people the way they want to be talked about, and the way they want people to talk about them. In the same way we ask people what names they like to use. I have a best friend. He doesn't like to use his first name. It's attached to a father that he doesn't know and doesn't like. So he uses his middle name. Nobody questions that. I think when we start to attach these things, though, to the LGBTQ community, we start to find a way to like politicize or demonize them. And really, it's just like we're just really trying to be respectful. Like before we jumped on, you had said, I think somebody else in here, Laura, is that right? Yeah. Laura had said, how do you want your name on your screen? Do you want it to be Tammy? Do you want it to be your full name? Do you want it to be Tam? And you picked. You said, "I want to be Tam." And you did exactly what LGBTQ people do all the time. And the same thing with pronouns.
The explanation and the education behind it, as well as with the acronyms, makes me realize more about these pronouns, because I used to say, well, why would I be a they? How is that? I don't have a split personality. I mean, really, I'm just being very transparent in what was going through my head. And that's why we need to have, education and be able to talk and communicate. Some would say these are tough conversations. I don't think these are tough conversations. These are just conversations that need to be had, and we need to understand. I've got one more question, because then I want to go into the breakout room. But how is LGBT plus identity experienced uniquely when it's at the intersection? Okay, because this is all about intersectionality, the intersection of being a person of color, you know, when in healthcare, or a person with a disability or disabled person. You know, let's talk about that for a few minutes around the intersection of LGBTQ plus and intersectionality.
Ooh, it's super important when we talk about being LGBTQ that a lot of people see this population in a vacuum, sort of like we all live in like a Lisa Frank reality together. And it's just like, unfortunately, it's not true. The LGBTQ community suffers the same societal ills and biases that other communities do, or larger communities do, namely around ableism, namely around can be sexism, there can be racism, there is, as a person of color, as a Black identified LGBTQ person, I have LGBTQ community members who are white, who are cisgender, who do not look at the world or experience the world the same way I do. This comes up a lot when we talk about things like gay marriage, for example. And that was a huge endeavor, spearheaded by the HRC. And it meant a lot to one group in the LGBTQ community, and that was predominantly white, affluent gay men who wanted to be able to do things like marry their partner so that they didn't lose access to the things they had accumulated together during life. Gay marriage didn't do a lot for two struggling Black lesbians who were trying to raise two small children from separate relationships or prior relationships, for example. Black lesbians are consistently the most underpaid group, no matter their education and their knowledgeability or specialization. I think they make somewhere around like 60 cents to the dollar still, 66 cents, something like that. The only group that is beneath them, or the only group that has an even lower income, is Latina women. And I don't even think they survey Latina women who are queer, right? So like so these things actually have a strong experience because there is huge socioeconomic differences in the LGBTQ community, and huge access differences. There's a lot of LGBTQ spaces, for instance, here in Philadelphia that are not readily accessible for people with disabilities or people who speak a different language, or English is their second language, or people who need access to ASL, unfortunately. And those people all exist in this community, but don't get the same access to resources. And so that means healthcare is limited because a lot of people who are LGBTQ want to be able to access an LGBTQ provider because they feel the safest with that person. But if that person doesn't provide a wheelchair ramp or ASL or a screen reader, they can't use the place that they're most comfortable. And so then they have to consider, how do I access healthcare and where would I access it? And what parts of me must I like hide or have to like overcome in order to get care? And that just feels really, it's super limiting. And maybe I'm talking about 10 people in Philadelphia, but that means there's 10 people in Philadelphia who can't get access in the places that they feel safe. And so that's what's really important about intersectionality in this population, this community, is addressing these issues and understanding that we have to make all fights our fight. And I say that for any other marginalized group. I say that for women all the time, because transphobia affects women directly. Transphobia doesn't affect men. And what I mean by that is that means that, let's say there's one of the favorite things that's happening right now is these limiting bathroom bills. Well, these bathroom bills mean that people are policing the women's bathroom. Nobody cares who goes into the men's bathroom, right? Because the argument wasn't about safety for men. There's not some really short trans man that's going into the men's bathroom that everybody's like, he shouldn't be in there. Nobody cares. These bills are specifically about policing how women look when they go to use the bathroom. Now, I was assigned female at birth. I am comfortable with both she, her pronouns and they, them pronouns. But now when I go to the bathroom, I'm policed because I have like short hair and I like to wear like t-shirts and jeans. I've seen tall women harassed going to the bathroom because women aren't 6'2", which is absurd because women are. But now being a uniquely tall woman means that someone can say, you may not be a woman. So these things are not separate. And I love to talk about how LGBTQ issues and like the struggle around feminism are intrinsically tied together. And in that intersectionality is necessary, that we can't separate them. Reproductive rights deeply affects the LGBTQ population because saying that life begins at, or personhood begins at conception means that we cannot have IVF clinics or IUI clinics because we have to develop fetuses or we have to develop embryos in order to implant. And if we're saying that every embryo is a person, then we can't cull them when we implant them. So we can't create them. These things are not separate.
Yeah, there's so much to learn. And I'm sure that we could, I'm going to say this again. I'm sure, at the end, there's not enough time, even with, a couple of days or a full day to really learn everything that we should be knowing about. And it's not just about acceptance. It's about being educated on this, having an understanding, because difference is what it is. I mean, we're all different. But then when you think about what the word different means, it has a negative connotation, such as how they want to take away DEI out of the education system, and replace it with different. And we know where that's going to go. I mean, so I want to, take us right into the breakout session rooms. I was going to do 12 minutes. Let's do 10 minutes. And during the breakout session, I'd like you to discuss what you heard, what was learned, what you thought you knew, and how you now know better. And we'd like to have a representative come back and just report out from your group. Lara, I'm going to turn this back over to you.
All right, so we have breakout rooms created. So as soon as I open them, you will all see a prompt to join. Evan, it did put you in one, so use your discretion. If you need a break for 5 minutes, please feel free to just ignore the invitation. But for the rest of us, as Tam said, we'll be in the rooms for 10 minutes. You will see a 30-second countdown, and then it will suck you back into this main room for the second half of our time together this morning. So enjoy your conversation. I'm going to broadcast the questions that Tam went over with Evan once you all are in the rooms, and we will see you back here in 10 minutes. So Tam, we had 4 rooms, so we should have 4 reporters.
Okay, so it is, let me just put some timing here. It's 8:59. We've got 30 minutes left. This has been so good. I almost wish it was 2 hours. But let's be very brief when we give our, output from our rooms. And let's start with, did you have it by room 1, 2, 3, and 4?
Yeah,
No,
it does 1,
we
2,
did.
3, 4, but I don't think anybody knows their room. So
Okay.
hopefully we have 4 people that know that they're the spokesperson nominated by their group.
Okay, so let's have 4 people. I'm going to nominate Aaliyah.
So in our group, we were talking about that we focused on how it's been exported, the fear. And I briefly shared that I was born in Pakistan and I lived there for about 16 years before coming to US, and how I saw transgender community here, and how when I came here, there's so much fear around it. And I was still working through that confusion. So that's where Evan made the point that, how this fear has been exported. Some Eastern countries, they deal with it in a very different way. They leave the gender alone for the most part. And Nicole talked about how US is not the standard anymore about how to behave, which is good in a way. And, it's heartbreaking at the same time. And we all collectively need to show up to the board meetings or wherever these conversations are happening. So that's what we talked about.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Someone else from another group.
I can talk. We talked, and we were interested in the I can't think of the word, that the exportation of homophobia. I thought that was really interesting. and that has long been, homophobia has long been a tool for autocratic leaning people, and that we sort of, I can see that we have, this country has mastered that political tool, and now it's becoming adopted worldwide. And another thing that we talked about was, one of the members talked about, I gave an example of a teacher and the level of sensitivity she used in trying to discern whether the student, was sort of wanted to be talked about in one way, but another way when the teacher was talking to the parents. And that you can see on the one hand, the level of sensitivity that is needed in the schools, but also that there are people who can do it. It's possible. And then the third was just if there are any resources for how to be a good ally, especially if you're an ally to the community as opposed to an individual. How do you, how do we communicate that to people that we are an ally?
Thank you, Cindy. That's great, because that's a great segue into the next session, which we may not be able to do a breakout session, but it's all about how we can show support and be an ally. The third breakout.
I can go. So we talked about a couple of things, the first of which was just the sheer learning from terminology. It reminded us of Middlesex, a book we had read before, so we were grateful for that little quick reminder. And then we were also talking about the importance of people being seen for who they were, but almost the flip side of that, or another way to look at it, is why do people care? Acknowledge who you are as you want to be, and stay out of people's bedrooms and their private lives. It's no one else's business. I don't need to know who you're interested in romantically, sexually, or whatever. When did that become an issue for everybody? Because who cares? And I think that was, and really that we really were talking about, and how all these issues also come down to money, because we were discussing the issues of insurance and insurance coverage and people applying their normative values to what I may want to do or what someone else wants to do. And that sort of got us into who makes those decisions, and it all is money at the end of the day. So that was sort of it in a nutshell, but we could have talked forever.
I'm sure that all of us could. The fourth breakout.
I'll go first. Thanks, Tracy. And Evan, thanks for sharing the book. It was a feminist writer about intersex, her experience. So yeah, same thing. We could have talked forever. I think the general consensus is we didn't know what we didn't know until we got here today, but have learned an immense amount of takeaways on, of course, what the acronyms mean, and the incredible history that we're not necessarily aware of the movement has been fascinating to learn about. Also, it was really interesting hearing the story about how the indigenous tribes felt, or how that was seen in their culture, or is in their culture, as opposed to, I guess, colonial cultures. And then finally, we talked about our children and grandchildren, and how they're experiencing these conversations, and how sometimes they can also be frustrated by having to figure out who they identify as, or what they identify as, So yeah, just fascinating conversation. Thank you.
This is great. All of the, things that have been learned and discussed in each group, as everyone has said, we could have gone on, but I'm going to try and pull us back in and keep us on track, because we definitely want to get to this next section. We won't be able to do a breakout session, but this is really important. And we want to talk about taking action and showing support. So Evan, the first question is, how can we support the LGBTQ plus community without our own sexual orientation becoming an issue? What are some, give us some guidance on that.
Oh, how can we support? I think, first of all, being proactive. I mean, I think a lot of times folks think that, I like to say that there's a difference between an ally and accomplice, right? And that the difference between, just like there's a difference between like my friend at work and my best friend, right? And I think in this current political tumult that we're seeing, and I think a lot of us are putting it together. I am really proud of us as a community, larger societal community, that some of us are seeing the thread between. It does not surprise me. I also think that people who are looking to subjugate different vulnerable populations have also tipped their hand and shown where they want to go with things, which is not stopping at any one teeny tiny group, right? Like trans people are like 1% of the population at best, maybe 2, if we're doing a really good look at the data set that we have. But I think more and more cisgender women especially have picked up on the fact that, like, okay, yeah, that's a really small population that can't really defend itself, but that's not where it stops. It's certainly, the goal is to get to that, 55%, which is women, like all of them. And that includes, women with disabilities, that includes women of all different colors, all of that. So I think one of the key ways to be an ally is to recognize, number one, you're not a separate community. We're having the same struggle. We're just having it at different intervals, right? Because once there's a completion of subjugation for one group, there is an expansion into subjugating another. People who seek to be cruel, and people who seek authoritarianism, and people who seek to minimize the humanity of others are never full. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Pan's Labyrinth years ago, but there was a character in it that sat at a table with a feast at it, and he was always eating and never full. And that character is sort of an analogy for people who are looking to be subjugating to others and dehumanizing to others. And so being proactive is really important, and being proactive and inclusive. So if you have a feminist book club reading that is women only, to understand that trans women should be there too, or non-binary people who were assigned female at birth should be there too, because those people have the same fight. That you're not closing other women out by including these other people who have the same issues in. When you talk about reproductive rights, if you talk about reproductive rights and access, talk about other pregnant people like trans men who are having their lives limited or placed in danger because of their inability to access reproductive care. Because the problem with demonizing reproductive rights means that quite often medical professionals flee the space because they don't want to have to just watch somebody grow sick and die. That goes against everything that they've learned. And so reproductive issues and the limiting of them and the rights really affect everyone, because it means anybody who's pregnant now may not have a safe place to give birth. And we're watching people get sick. We bring this back to health. We're watching people get sick and have their lives deeply affected or end over what I would deem very archaic issues that have easy medical interventions, but because of access. So to see the threads with all these things is the best way, and to be as inclusive, even if your focus is on things that are hyper specific to your identities, to recognize there are other people that share that with you. Oh, Tam, you're mute.
Thank you. Is there a particular way, and I've wanted to ask this question, but never knew how to actually ask it. How should I address someone who identifies, with the LGBTQ plus community without offending them or sounding ignorant?
What do you mean, in like what way? I mean, like,
like if someone, they are a trans woman or male, or they identify as queer, but maybe I don't know this, even someone that is trans, would I, if we're in a conversation and we're talking about genderism or something like that, is there a particular way that you can ease into a conversation or even ask someone, how do they identify and how would they prefer me to address them?
So actually, this is a very easy answer because instead of spotlighting that person, I like to use myself as an example. So when I meet people, I willingly offer those things. I say, hi, my name is Evan. I use she or they pronouns. What about you? And so I think what that does for people is that it gives the indication that you more learned or more expansive or more inclusive, rather than being like, like, because I'm going to tell you, like, sometimes when people have asked me and been like, how do you identify or whatever, but the way that their question came out, sometimes you hear it as like, how you identify, like,
Yeah.
What about you? And you're like, oh no. Because I've been in all sorts of spaces. I mean, I've been in like rural Nepal and like, and people ask these questions. And so when you're used to the experience, especially looking the way that I do, that question of like, what are you? Because sometimes that's how people structure the question. You're not sure what they're asking for. Are they asking because they're preparing to be cruel to you, or are they asking because they're trying to be inclusive? And it's been a 50-50 shot. So I think the easiest way to really display what you're trying to display is to just use yourself first, because you're autonomous. I mean, I'm a bioethicist, and so I love to talk about agency and autonomy. Using yourself as an example, because you are the full ownership of you, is the easiest way.
Thank you for that, because this is why the pronouns are important. And even starting a conversation. I mean, I will admit, I'm always transparent, sometimes to a fault, but I've been that person who, I'm going to say probably a couple of years ago would have said, so what are you? And, understanding through time that, first of all, that is offensive, because I've been asked that in that manner about other things. And so, and I didn't like it. So why would I turn that around? But sometimes we don't think before we speak. And that's why it's so important to be educated and to have these conversations. If there's someone that, say, for example, they're in the workplace or in the family and they, want to come out, but just don't know how to, but how would we make ourselves more approachable?
I mean, the coming out process is personal. I will say that.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we can do everything that we can do and the person still has not yet comfortable. And we have to sometimes, I think a lot of times with people, when someone doesn't share something with us, and I see this in friend groups all the time, right? When somebody doesn't share something with us, we personalize it. We're like, this is about me. They don't think I can handle this information. I don't know why she didn't tell me about her divorce, or I don't know why he didn't tell me that he lost his job. We kind of personalize it. When really sometimes I like to say give grace. It's my mother's favorite. She also likes to say think twice, speak once, because you you can't fix it once it leaves your mouth. But I think if we started to think more expansively beyond ourselves, and think also about like, how would we emotionally respond to discovering something about ourselves or something happening in our lives? It's a journey that sometimes doesn't always have pride or comfortability to it. So that's the caveat I will give, is that sometimes we'll do everything we can in people because of embarrassment or fear or struggle, that has nothing to do with anybody else. That's just their internal turmoil, may still not say something to us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the best ways is to see, again, that proactivity, right? Like when I tell people like pride is for everyone, because pride is a riot, pride is a protest. People showed up, I remember years ago in like 2017, 2018, 2017, where there was that, you know, horrible ban on like Muslim travel, right? And it was not just Muslim people who were at the airport in Philly. Like I was there, you know, I was like, we gonna let people in today, you know, like
Yeah.
that proactivity. So I like to say that about LGBTQ things like Pride, for example. I mean, obviously respect spaces where people want to center a community, like don't make it about you, but we don't have to inhabit any of the identities to go spaces where people are being celebrated or people are trying to create, because there's safety in numbers. And so like in Philadelphia this year, we had over 10,000 people at Pride in the streets. All of them couldn't possibly, or maybe they could have been, but most of them, or a substantial portion of them, had to have been people from other communities who simply wanted to add bodies and voice and create cacophony for these voices. So I think participation, active participation, right? Don't wait till somebody comes out with you to be like, do you want to go to Pride? Whether they've come out to you or not, be like, hey, I want to go to Pride. I want to go make sure people can see that I'm not going to put up with these bathroom bills or these, you know, drag bans or whatever it is that people are trying to do, or these threatening lives or whatever. Proactivity is the best way to feel safe, because people know that you mean it, because you're willing to put yourself, again, that you have control of this, put yourself in it. Put skin in the game, as like, again, I love quoting my mother because she's, you know, she's a little Georgian Black lady and she always has these euphemisms that I love, but putting skin in the game is like super important.
You know, I want to open this up to others, you know, whether you want to put your questions in the chat or you want to come off mute and ask a question, just raise your hand. But, you know, because I'm sure that there are a lot of other questions besides the last couple that I have, which you've really answered, you know, as you were talking about just, you know, a lot here. There's so much to take in. And one of the questions here is, how do we get a sense for whether people want, and she has want in all caps, want us to know their preferences? It's like similar to what I was talking about earlier. You know, what are you? And then that's been asked of me, and I actually got quite offended when I would be asked that. So how do we get a sense for when people actually want us to know their preferences, or even want us to know what their pronouns are? Because as you know, pronouns have been politicized a lot. And so people say, why do I even need to do this? I'm not doing this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think respecting, yeah, I think it's about what people want. And sometimes people just want to connect with you beyond these identities. I like to tell people that it's very exhaustive being a Black person and being an LGBTQ person and being a Black LGBTQ person. And the reason why it's exhaustive is because people want to talk about those things. And sometimes I want to talk about my love of Batman, you know, like nobody ever asks me how I would like, you know, nobody ever, you know, says like, hey, Evan, do you want to do a 1-hour presentation on like the allegory that is the Joker? Tragedies, because I can. So it's about knowing when people want you to know them as an individual, and knowing when it's important for you to know and know that about them. I think it's important for people to know about me because it is part of how I see the world and it's part of my lens in the world. But also sometimes I just want to like cool out, you know, and be asked. I love reading. I love reading all sorts of things. I especially love medical anthropology. But being asked what I'm reading. And so that's what we want to know about folks, I think, is when it's important that we should know these things, or when they would want us to know it, if they do. And if they don't want us to know that about them, it doesn't mean that they're trying to withhold something. It might mean that they actually just really want to connect with you on something you have in common, or something that they really love too, that they think about more, like Batman.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Lauren, Lara, Tracy, you know, anyone have some final questions or, you know, just thoughts for Evan?
Well, I'll start with gratitude. This has been an amazing morning. It's I don't know how it's been 80 minutes already, quite honestly. It feels like it's been about 10. I learned things. I was going to say, so Evan, what's your favorite Batman? Who's your favorite Batman? And Cindy kind of beat me to it. She can't wait to see it come back, see Michael Keaton come back.
Well, first, of course, Michael Keaton is a classic Batman. That's important to note. I love the Batman comic books, and my favorite book is called The Killing Joke. And it's an allegory for what makes a villain? Is it intention? Is it action? And so it's really, really amazing because it's a conversation between Batman and the Joker. He has caught the Joker and he's put him in like handcuffs and he's waiting for the cops to come pick him up. And the Joker starts to kind of toy with him psychologically and say, well, how are you not a villain too? And if you didn't have me, would you also be a villain? And so it gets into like this conversation of what is good and do we justify bad acts when the intention is good, or the goal ultimately does the goal serve the purpose? Obviously, as someone who specializes in ethics, I love these questions.
I think about that as like, I can't see it in you if it's not within myself. So if I decide that like someone's evil, where does that reside in me? And that was a total tangent. But anyway, back to your actual topic. Thanks for playing along.
It's not a total tangent because I think that it's integral to this conversation, right? I mean, the fact that we see people as good or evil has a lot to do with how we identify what our values are, our perspective that we take. And that's part of the problem, right? When we other people, we're seeing them somehow as threatening to us. And I think that these kinds of conversations are so important. I thank you so much, Evan, for the openness, the ability for people to ask questions without being made to feel stupid, without, just being able to very non-defensively have conversation in this area, I think is so incredibly important, because the more people who are comfortable, the more it can become a so what. Right? The more it can become just part of the world, just regular. Like you said, right? We can hardly even imagine a culture where people's sexuality wasn't titillating and interesting to us, because it's so deep, the reasons why that is true for us as a culture. But to know that there are cultures where nobody asked, there didn't need to be any LGBTQ plus to SAAP, whatever, because it just wasn't that interesting. I hope we can get to a place where we all are so educated that it just becomes a whole lot less interesting to us.
Yeah, and I mean, and information allows us to not be misled either. One of the things that I talk about is how it's easy to tie the LGBTQ community to pedophilia if you can instill a feeling or a sense of disgust. And it's really the sense of, a lot of people talk about homophobia as a fear, and actually for a lot of people, it's not a fear, it's about eliciting disgust. And if you can elicit a sensation of disgust about a population, then you can tie that population to the most disgusting person you know. Does that make sense? And that's really important to how we realign our morals to include dehumanization. If I can find people with disabilities disgusting, I can execute ugly laws and say they shouldn't be seen in public. If I can find different religious groups disgusting, well, that's how I can ban them from travel. If I can find, so we have to recognize, and that, so it's not a trick that they're tied to things like pedophilia, because we want to elicit a sensation of disgust, which creates our ability to realign or dehumanize a group. And so that's why it's important to understand these things and understand that, like, a lot of LGBTQ people are more likely to make tea on Friday night than whatever sexual act you're imagining in your mind, which is also weirdo behavior. Like, stop imagining that. I don't meet straight people and go, and like, I don't meet like a straight couple who's married and go like, I wonder what that looks like. I don't do that. Think about that's nasty. Like, for everybody.
Yes.
Lucy, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to, and this sort of ties into all the things that we're talking about. One of the things that came up in our group when Evan, you were talking about, unnecessary surgery or for intersex children without, there was no consent. We kind of compared that to genital mutilation, and that the world at large is up in arms and demonizes that. But yet this is okay. Like, why is that not being viewed in a similar way? You know, so it kind of talks back to, you know, the ethics, the demonization of certain groups. Like, why is it okay and why is it not okay for some? So I just wanted to bring that point out, that it was, you know, it was such a thought-provoking conversation that you provided us with, Evan, that we obviously all went in some very powerful directions. So thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us this morning.
Well, I love that point that you all were talking about, because I love how when we apply racism, right, it can either legitimize or delegitimize also something, right? So we love to talk about how African countries have this female genital mutilation issue, and like we love to make a big deal out of it. And it's like there's a lot to unpack there that I won't do in 2 minutes. But right, but then here, because it's Western medicine, or because it's predominantly led by like white leadership, and Western white leadership, intersex surgeries are not in the same vein for a lot of people. And so we also want to think, again, there's that intrinsic tie of intersectionality of like, we can convince people that this group is bad. One of the biggest fights when we talk about LGBTQ rights in this country is like, yeah, but in Arabic countries, they throw them off buildings. First of all, that's not true. And second of all, queer people live in those spaces. And that is an oversimplification of Middle Eastern populations. It's an oversimplification of those cultures and communities. And again, where did they learn that hatred from? They learned that hatred from colonization or interacting with like our modern communities. So saying that like it shouldn't be a problem to ban people from a bathroom because we're not stoning them to death is sort of like a really low bar, if you think like, you know. And we do that with women's rights too. We're like, I don't know why women are so up in arms about this. They can have jobs and have their own bank accounts. And I'm like, because in this tiny country that has 130,000 people in it, you know, women are property. And I'm like, why are we talking about them? Like, that doesn't make what's happening here any better. And so I love that you point that out, that if we can apply a brown face to it, we can use it as a comparative, and we can always make it seem worse, and we can minimize the perception of harm that's happening here.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being on today. But Evan, I, just want to give you this virtual hug, because you have really enlightened me, and I'm sure everyone here. I want to go back one more time to the mission of Ellevate. And it's why we're all here. It's why we're a part of this organization, which is to create a world where everyone belongs by helping women who challenge the status quo to thrive at work. But there's one more thing that Ellevate does. They say that through collective action, Ellevate is shaping businesses to be more inclusive with a goal of full and equal access to power for everyone. And I think that, hearing the conversation today, getting our questions answered, really learning, having more understanding. So now that we can go out and talk to others about this is really important. And Evan, we'll be sending out your information with our follow-up. If you have any podcasts, I know there's a recent podcast that you did, so we're going to include that in our follow-up, so that those that are on the call can listen and also share. But if there's anything that you're having that is open, please let us know. We would like to continue this conversation and not let it stop here.
I will fully admit secretly, and I don't know if this is the group that has it, but I have a TikTok account. It is very popular. It is Evan the Bioethicist. So if you want to know more about bioethics and history and all those things, I definitely do it there. So follow at your own risk. No, I'm just kidding. So that's the thing I'll share. And then there's podcasts. I always link my podcasts on my LinkedIn. So please feel free to explore those. Those are some amazing people with some amazing podcasts. They're not my podcast. I was just featured on them. Please follow some of them. There's one that's really amazing about medical communication that I just absolutely love, that I recently did with two really stellar doctors. But yeah, check all those things out, explore it. You can follow me on LinkedIn or connect.
Awesome. Awesome. Lara, I'm going to have you close us out.
Thank you. Tam and Evan, thank you for creating such a brave space this morning. This has been incredible. And I know we lost a few people, but please feel free to put your LinkedIn in the chat if it would be helpful in our last minute or two together. I'm going to hop over and start following Evan. Actually, I think I already do, but I'm going to make sure. So thank you all so much for being here.
And have a wonderful weekend.
Yes. Have a wonderful
Bye, everybody.
weekend.
Right. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Really, really helpful. Thanks.